Good afternoon, everyone. There are plenty of seats in the front rows. This is like in the classroom, right? Nobody wants to sit close to the instructors, but really, we're quite a friendly bunch. Anyway, it's my pleasure to welcome you. I'm Suzanne Grant-Lewis. I'm the director of UNESCO's International Institute for Educational Planning, and very pleased to see you all today. I think we're live streaming, so I want to also welcome our virtual audience, which has joined us from different parts of the world, and we're very pleased to have you with us. This seminar today, this debate, is the fifth in a series of seminars that are focused on SDG 4's learning objective, in which we've subtitled it "Looking Beyond the Obvious." Because there's widespread recognition of the global learning crisis, with millions of children and youth unable to perform basic skills in reading, writing, and mathematics. But what's less clear is, what do children need to learn for the future? And how can we foster all-inclusive quality education for this rapidly changing future? In pursuit of SDG 4, we have to look beyond the obvious and debate new ideas and strategies that will ultimately redefine learning while also ensuring accessibility for all. So this is the fifth. We've looked at a wide range of issues, including social and emotional skills, higher education as a common good. We've looked inside the classrooms of the world's, quote, superpowers. And we've looked, just a couple weeks ago, we looked at how do we overcome Africa's learning crisis. So today we're addressing artificial intelligence. Can education systems anticipate the challenges ahead? I would encourage everybody to think about questions because we'll be sure that we have a significant amount of time for discussion. And this is true for our online audience as well. And note that you can ask questions in English or French. There are headsets for translation if you prefer to hear it in French when we're all speaking English, or vice versa. So there you go. And I'd also encourage you, all you tweeters out there, hashtag strategic debate, and IEP is at UNESCO. Okay, it's automatic on my phone, sorry. At IIEP_UNESCO. Thank you. So today we're discussing artificial intelligence and its implications for education. AI, like the big data it's tries to master, seems ubiquitous in public policy and public debates. Here in France, the government launched the Villani report on the 29th of March this year, and President Macron presented a program to make France a leader in artificial intelligence, committing 1.5 billion euros over the next 5 years. But UNESCO also has had a long history of interest in AI. I found online a UNESCO Courier article from 1987 that was all about AI and robotics. But as Stuart said, I probably could have gone further back and found one in the 60s, also concerned about artificial intelligence. But more recently, UNESCO's engagement has been on through the World Commission on the Ethics of Scientific Knowledge and Technology of UNESCO, called Economist. And they released a report in October last year, trying to raise awareness and promote public consideration and an inclusive dialogue about ethical issues concerning the different use of contemporary robotic technologies in society. Our new Director General, Audrey Azoulay, has also expressed an interest in positioning UNESCO in this global debate about artificial intelligence, possibly more focused on the ethical dimensions of it. The impact of AI is seen in many sectors, and it's already evident. You see a lot of reference to it with regards to tools of war and defense, unfortunately, but also in medical diagnosis, medical imaging, redesigning transport systems, autonomous cars, etc. There's a lot of debate in the media on the potential impact on the labor market, and that, of course, concerns all of us who work in education. Just one little factoid. So Facebook is opening up new AI labs in Seattle and Pittsburgh. It already has artificial intelligence labs in Silicon Valley, New York, Paris, and Montreal. And that's one company, a big one, but one company. Universities in the United States have started expressing some fear. They've raised the alarm about the loss of faculty to internet companies that are building AI labs all over the place. And universities like Carnegie Mellon, University of Washington, and UC Berkeley are concerned that their AI and robotics faculty are disappearing, and that the universities, these great research universities, won't have the faculty necessary to prepare the next generation of researchers. These internet providers are what they call eating the seed corn. So in higher ed, it's also a big debate vis-a-vis the labor market. Today, we're going to explore some of the implications for education globally. What's hype? What's reality now? What's likely to happen? And perhaps most importantly, what are the choices and the actions we need to consider? Fortunately, we have a couple of experts to help guide us through this discussion. So I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker and discussant. On my far right is Stuart Elliott, who is Henry David Visiting Scholar at the United States National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. He rejoined there in 2017 after spending several years at OECD. Down the road here. There he was the project leader for the study on the future of skill-based technological change in the Directorate of Education and Skills. He led a study using OECD's Survey of Adult Skills, known as PIAC, to look at the relationship between technology, skills, and productivity, including a comparison of the capabilities of humans and computers using PIAC. He's given a lot of thought to what the automation of different occupations over the next few decades implies for work, education, and the economy. Stuart also completed a report on the test of problem solving with computers, which is part of PIAC. Before he joined OECD in 2014, Stuart directed the Board on Testing and Assessment of the National Academies for over 10 years. And here he led numerous studies on educational tests and indicators, assessments of science and 21st century skills, the applications of information technologies, and occupational preparation and certification. So Stuart has a PhD in economics from MIT and also undertook postdoc training in cognitive psychology at Carnegie Mellon University. So you probably heard what I just reported on, the panic at Carnegie Mellon. We're very pleased that Stuart is with us today. And serving as our discussant is a colleague from UNESCO, Stephen Vosloo, who's the Senior Project Officer in the section of Youth Literacy and Skills Development. Stephen is a Mobiles for Development, or M for D. There's a lot of X for D, M for, so he's M for D Program Manager, Mobiles for Development, with a particular focus on mobile learning, youth, and ICTs. So Stephen's currently program specialist in the mobile learning, which you probably are aware that UNESCO every year has a fantastic mobile learning week at Fontenoy in the 7th. And he's managing the UNESCO Nokia partnership. Previously, Stephen was a fellow of the 21st Century Learning at the Shuttleworth Foundation, which is a very interesting South Africa-based social investor supporting individuals engaged in social change. Stephen has founded the M for Lit, Mobiles for Literacy project, which demonstrated the power and potential of mobile publishing to support teen reading and writing in South Africa and in Kenya. So we're very pleased that you're here with us today, Stephen. So thank you very much. I will move over there to listen attentively and come back when it's time for moderating the discussion. So over to you, Stuart. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Suzanne, and thank you to Michaela and the rest of the crew here for the invitation to speak at IIEP. It's wonderful to be here. So as the title slide says, I'm going to talk about artificial intelligence. and whether or not education systems can anticipate the challenges ahead. And I want to jump right to the end of the talk and say that my answer is going to be yes, but I'm not going to be providing you with that answer. So I'm going to give you some pieces, but then I'm going to shift into proposal mode and describe to you the work that needs to be done so that we can actually figure out a full systematic way to anticipate the challenges that are ahead. So because I'm from education, or partly because I'm from education, I want to link the impact of AI from the occupational side to what needs to go on in education. So a lot of these conversations end up being about the future of work, but I want to transform the conversation into a conversation that's about the future of skills. So shifting the focus away from jobs to skills, and to look in particular at two questions. What transition is required? That is, what transition in skills is required? And is that transition one that's going to be feasible? And I particularly want to be able to get to the second question, because the second question actually concerns a lot more than just the education sector. I actually believe that it's in that question that lies the answer to the larger question about whether or not AI is a different technology than the technologies we've seen in the past. So there is the possibility that AI actually essentially sort of threatens the entire work-based structure of our economy and society. And if it's going to do that, it's in the answer to the question about whether or not the change that we need to make in skills is a change that's going to be feasible for us to make. So that's where I'm headed. To answer these questions, I want to propose that we use a tool from education. So the tool is standardized tests. And I'm going to propose that we evaluate what AI can do using the same kinds of tests that we use for people. And I want to propose that for two reasons. First of all, having spent a long time in testing and assessment, I think that it's going to produce much more credible answers than if we try to have the discussion without a tool like tests. Second of all, because I know that there are lots of tests out there that we use for talking about what people know and can do, I know that if we assess what computers can do with tests like that, then in a sense for free, we get a way of comparing what computers can do with what people can do. And that comparison is in terms that folks in this room who understand education can make sense of. And it links into the larger conversations that we have about what our education systems are producing and whether or not that's adequate. So it's a way of bridging a gap from the conversation that takes place in the IT world into a set of play within the rest of society where we understand what certain types of educational preparation mean and we understand a certain set of educational challenges. But ordinarily, when we talk about AI, though that conversation is entirely separate. And at this moment in time, it's really important that that conversation no longer be separate from what the rest of us are concerned about. All right, now I want to talk just a little bit about the first reason for using formal tests. Answer, a more credible answer about what it is that computers can do. And to make the first part of this point, I want to draw a contrast to a study that probably many of you have heard, a study that was done in at Oxford. It's by the team of Frey and Osborne. You may well not have heard those names, but it's probably the 47% figure that you have heard of. So this is the 47%. Talk about that one. But the 47% study has gotten the most pickup in the press. And so that figure is the proportion of jobs in the US economy that this report predicted could be threatened by automation over the next couple of decades. So there have been a lot of people who have reacted to that particular projection. There have been a lot of criticisms of this work. I'm going to now give another of criticism, but it's one I think that is often missed. This is a criticism that applies to the very start of the analysis by the Oxford team. And the start of the analysis relates to how did they figure out what it is that computers can do? And what they did was to assemble a set of task descriptions for different occupations. And they asked computer scientists to review those task descriptions and to say whether or not computers could do these things. So in red, this is an example of one of these task descriptions. So this is for the occupation of a judicial law clerk. So one of the legal professions, and not at the top, not a full lawyer, but someone sort of slightly farther down. And the task is to review complaints. That's a particular type of legal document, a legal complaint, that have been filed to determine the issues involved. So computer scientists were asked to review descriptions like this to say whether or not computers could do this kind of task. And the problem is that as it's written, you can't answer the question. There simply isn't enough information about this task to be able to say whether or not computers at this point in time can do something like this. So it could be that legal complaints are structured in a particular way so that each of the legal issues involved is in a separate section, and there's a heading on each section which gives a description of the issue. If that's the way they're usually done, then it would be quite easy to identify the issues involved, because you just go through and take all the section headings and line them up, and then you're done. But it could be that legal complaints aren't written that way at all. Or it might be that some of them are written the first way and some of them are written the second way. We just don't know that from this description. So the problem with the Frey and Osborne work and some of the other similar studies that have been done, like the 49% study that I'm not talking about, is that they have this similar problem. The information that has been gathered about what computers can do is at such a coarse level that the judgments you can't have any trust in. So the starting point isn't a starting point that you can have confidence that we actually know where the technology is. So then the rest of the analysis, there's no reason to pay attention to. So instead, I'm going to talk about using formal tests that get around this problem. So to do that, it's good to have an example, and the example that I'm going to use is the one that Suzanne already mentioned, which is PIAC, the OECD's Survey of Adult Skills. I assume that most of you know about PIAC, but for any of those of you who don't, PIAC measures 3 skills that are widely used at work. Those are literacy, numeracy, and a type of problem solving. At least within OECD countries, about 3/4 of workers use one or more of these skills every day at work. So they're important to the workplace in developed countries, but they're also very important in education. So we make huge developments in developing these skills during formal education, particularly the first 2, literacy and numeracy. So it's collectively years of time developing those 2 skills. So these are not this is not a random example. This is actually a very central example to focus on. Because of the role that these skills play in education, we often think about them in academic terms, but one of the really interesting things about PIAC is that the questions attempt to be more practical in nature, so that they are they involve kinds of tasks that people can imagine doing either at work or in their personal lives, not just things that they would do while they're in school. So I want to give you a couple of examples from the test so that you understand the kinds of questions that adults are asked to answer. So the first question is one about placing an international call. And the text looks like a website. So it's the kind of website that you might find if you did a search on your laptop for information about how to place an international call. So it's structured in the same way that a website is structured. And then the question asks when you would use a particular code in making an international call. And so in answering this question, you can imagine going through the text and trying to figure out where does the text say something about this particular code. For those of you who remember to read instructions before you take a test, there's a helpful instruction, which is that you just need to highlight the information to answer the question. Now, if you know anything about taking tests, this actually makes this a substantially easier question because you don't have to give the answer in your own words, and you might make a mistake at that point. But that part is excluded from this question. All right, so that's the first example. The second example feels a little bit more academic, a little bit more like something that you might do in school because it involves books. So it's related to the results of a library search for books on genetically modified foods. And so there are 10 or 12 books. For each book, you have a title and you've got a very short description of what's in the book. And then the question asks, which of the books suggests that the claims for and against genetically modified foods are both unreliable? So none of the descriptions of the books actually says that, but one of the descriptions sort of says, this is a controversial topic and there are problems on both sides of the argument. So if you understand that description and you understand what this question is asking, you realize, okay, there's a match here. This is the book, which is the answer to the question. And again, this is not something that you need to have specialized knowledge. You don't need to know about genetically modified foods to answer the question. And it could well be that this is a topic that you're interested in your personal life or that you've been asked to do some research on at work. It doesn't necessarily have to be something that you would do in a school setting. Now, these questions on PIAC are graded on a 5-level scale. So here are the levels associated with these two questions. The international call is a question at level 3, so it's in the middle of the difficulty scale, and the library search question is at level 4, so it's slightly more difficult. So keep those in mind, and then we'll move on to looking at how adults do on these questions. So here are the average results for adults in OECD countries. So adults are also placed on the same 5-level scale, and you're placed at the level which is the highest level that you're able to answer. So you can see that slightly over half of adults in OECD countries are at level 2 and below. So that means they can't reliably answer the question on making an international call. Slightly less than half the adults are able to answer that question, but only 11% of adults in developed countries are able to answer the library search question. This is a sobering set of results. So that is what it is, but that's not why I'm here. So that was just the setup. we took the same questions that are given to adults and gave them to computer scientists, not for them to answer on their own, but for them to figure out, can computers answer these same questions using state-of-the-art techniques in artificial intelligence. So there are a bunch of details about how we had that conversation, but I'm just going to jump right to the result. So this is the result for current AI techniques. So AI can answer questions at levels 1 and 2, is close to being able to answer questions at level 3, and is not close at all to being able to answer questions at levels 4 and 5. So the good news, in a sense, is that there are definitely things that computers can't do yet. But the bad news is that most adults can't do those things either. So this is the moment where you might wonder whether there's a problem with the feasibility of actually being able to move people into the jobs that remain. Want to switch gears now and talk a little bit about how we think about a number like this. So I want to start off by saying very clearly, this does not mean that only 11% of the workers in developed countries are still going to be employed in 10 or 20 years. Okay? We know that people do lots of other things at work than use literacy skills. So this is a very incomplete analysis as it is. So I want to walk through a way of thinking about how to think about this kind of figure. And so I'm going to do a more complex analysis and go to 2 skills rather than 1 skill. So this is just to provide us with a way of thinking about what does this kind of result mean. So yes, this is a very simple model of skill adjustment. So in this version, there are two skills. So there are cognitive skills on the one hand and physical skills on the other. This is a very useful contrast because cognitive skills tend to be ones that are developed in education, and physical skills are ones that tend to be developed outside of education. So by looking at this contrast, it provides us with a way of thinking about the relative importance of education in developing the skills that people will need in the future. So this table, conceptually, is showing different combinations of skills or levels of proficiency in skills that would belong to different possible jobs. So you can think about a job as having either low, medium, or high levels of cognitive skills, and then also low, medium, and high levels of physical skills. And any job is some combination of those two. So I'm going to put data in there. And so the data are taken from the US using its occupational information system. I could have also made up this data, but it works perfectly fine to use real data as well. So, I mean, mostly what we're thinking about this is as an illustration. So now, I talked about the PIAAC literacy test. So we have a measure on the cognitive skill side. We don't have a measure on the physical skill side, but let's think a little bit about that, the capabilities on AI of being able to perform at levels 1, 2, and almost level 3 in literacy. So you might think that that's sort of roughly the medium level of the cognitive skills. And so you can imagine that the techniques that are currently in the lab over the next 10 or 20 years are going to be increasingly applied in lots of different jobs throughout the economy. So that provides the possibility of all of those jobs in that middle row of medium cognitive skills beginning to be affected by the new capabilities of computers. So you can think about increasingly using computers as cognitive assistants to make the tasks that people have to do in those jobs much easier. So you don't actually have to read the manual that tells you how to perform some task. The computer just knows that you need to do that, and it tells you what to do. So you may now no longer need to read at PIAC level 2 or 3. PIAC level 1 may be perfectly adequate, or you may not even need to read at all in your job because you're just having a conversation with the computer and it's just telling you what to do. So this is a result where using AI results in de-skilling. So people now need much lower levels of skill than they needed in the past. But you can see that the physical skills are actually still required. So this isn't a step that is necessarily eliminating any of these jobs. It's dumbing them down. All right, we haven't talked about the physical skills, but we could talk about the physical skills, although we don't have a test for it. But all of us have heard about self-driving cars and factories without any workers. So you might imagine that the physical skills at the medium level might also be subject to some replacement by computers. So you could go through a similar de-skilling process where we start to use computers as physical assistants as well in many different occupations. Now you can see exactly where I'm headed here. We have a bunch of employment that's piling up in the cell involving low levels of the only 2 skills that exist in this world. And so you might think that those jobs would be automated, but our friends, the economists, tell us that unemployment will not be a problem because we know the economy will just move people around and people will move into the jobs that remain. We can see the 2 cells where there's still employment. So if you imagine that the remaining unemployed people just get distributed to those jobs that remain, there we have a new economy. Everything is in equilibrium, everyone is employed, all that's perfectly fine. So that's the end of the simple model. Why did I go through it? I went through the simple model because I want to make a very simple point. During the first portion of the model, when we were just looking at the automation on the cognitive side, what happened was the jobs were de-skilled and we needed less education. Then during the second stage, we started to look at automating both the cognitive side and the physical side. And in that version, we ended up needing much more education. So that then raises the question, is the right response less education or more education? And the answer is, it depends on what happens with the skills developed outside of education. We need to know whether or not there are lots of things for people to do in the economy that don't require education, to know whether or not we need to be pushing really hard on the education side. So if you look at the results with respect to the PIAC literacy test, that's why you can't conclude that we're going to have 89% unemployment. Because it could be that the driverless cars and the workerless factories are just unusual cases, and that there's a lot of physical stuff that really is very difficult to do and that people will be needed to do. And so it may be that we're on the verge of a huge de-skilling. The only way that we can tell that is by actually looking carefully at the physical skills and how far along computers are to being able to reproduce those skills. So the point is, we actually need to look at all the different skills that people have, not just the ones that we tend to focus on in education, the ones that are developed in education. All right, now I want to make another point. I want to focus on scenario 2. So that's the one where all of that employment piles up in the jobs involving high levels of cognitive skills. So thinking back to the PIEC literacy example, that suggests that we need a lot more people at levels 4 and 5. And so I want to think a little bit about that. So the good news is that we can do better than the OECD average of 11%. So in particular, we know that adults with higher education, 21% of them are at levels 4 and 5. Parenthetically, that is really disappointing. That means that 79% of adults who have some higher education credential can't reliably answer the library search question. But we'll set that aside. We also know that some countries do better than others. So adults in Japan with higher education, 37% of them are at levels 4 and 5. And that's great. But we shouldn't congratulate ourselves too much because these improvements are really hard. And despite all of the efforts across the globe over the past couple of decades, at least in the developed countries, the direction has been in the wrong way. So there are fewer adults at levels 4 and 5 in the OECD countries now than was the case in the 1990s. And no, we don't know why that's the case. And even if we were moving in the right direction, if you think about the box at the end of the simple example with 95% of employment involving jobs with high cognitive skills, in the PIEC data, we don't see anything that's like that anywhere. So we don't have any examples where 95% of adults are at levels 4 and 5. We can't point to a country. We can't point to a population subgroup. We can't point to an intervention. We don't see examples where 80% of adults are at levels 4 and 5. We don't even see examples where 50% of adults are at levels 4 and 5. So that suggests that if we're in scenario 2, that we may have a problem with feasibility. It doesn't mean that it's not possible, but it means that we don't have ready at hand a set of interventions where we can say, the policy community needs to do this to respond. We actually don't know how we would respond to that. And that then raises the question about whether or not we will be able to continue with full employment. So I don't want you to leave with that depressing message. So to be upbeat and have sort of a positive direction, the point that I really want to make is that we need more information. Because we simply don't know at this point whether we do need more education or whether we may actually need less education. And if we are in the position of needing more education, we don't know whether it's the type of skill improvement that we actually know how to produce. So in terms of a policy message, I think that the policy message at this point in time with respect to AI is we ought to be getting better information so that we know what to do, because we don't know what to do. And anyone who tells you that we know what to do is making it up. So I'm going to switch now to the proposal part of the talk and talk about a proposed joint program between the OECD and the US National Academies of Science. And that is to assess the capabilities of AI and robotics across the full set of work skills that people have in order to compare those skills to the skills that people have and to the potential of education to improve those skills. So switching gears now to the proposal. The basic structure for this work, there's four steps. The first is to group the skills that people have so that we can analyze them. The second step is to conduct separate studies about what AI can do within each of those skill groups. The third step is to use that information about AI to analyze different occupations. And then the last step is to propose a way of carrying out regular updates. So I'm going to talk about each of those steps briefly. So if you've looked at occupational data, oftentimes systems that try to describe what's going on in occupations have hundreds of skills or thousands of skills. In the case of the European Commission's new system, I think they advertise 13,000 skills. Seems like a lot. It's too many if we want to be conducting separate studies about each. And so the first step here is to group the skills in some sensible way. And the initial grouping that we're proposing is a grouping where the structure actually derives partly from computer science, with the notion that we want to be looking at skills together that actually share common computer techniques, so that we can bring the same experts around the table when we look at the skills within the same group. So this is a proposed grouping that sort of roughly does that. General cognitive skills are ones like PIAC measures. So that's skills like literacy and numeracy. They are skills that don't involve a lot of knowledge about a particular subject area. Expert skills, in contrast, involve a lot of knowledge about a particular subject area. So that might be a more academic domain like medicine or economics, or a more applied domain like plumbing or procedures at UNESCO. Physical skills are the kinds of things that robots do, and also to some extent still people. And social skills are things that we do in interacting with each other, and are often dismissed out of hand as things that computers can't do yet. But the argument is it's important to measure those as well to understand how far along computers are. So this is a possible grouping, but the reason there's a first step is to have arguments about that and figure out whether or not this is actually an adequate way. Could be that we'll decide that some different grouping would be better. The second step then is to conduct separate studies about each of the skill groups. And so the idea there is to assemble a set of formal tests within the skill group, and then to work with a group of experts to figure out how to assess what computers can do on each of the questions in each of those tests. And you can imagine that there will be disagreements across any group of experts. And so one of the key issues is going to be to figure out how to resolve those disagreements. The focus here is not on speculating about what computers can do 10 years from now. It's on identifying what we currently know how to do. So that should be a knowable thing. And so if the experts can't among themselves come to an agreement about their judgments, we could end up just holding contests to see what running systems people can submit that will be able to carry out or not carry out the different questions on the different tests. Out of this will then come essentially sort of a final report in each skill area that will say, okay, this is where the state of the art is with respect to this skill group, what computers can do, and how that compares to the distribution of performance in people. The third step then is to look at occupations. And this is now a switch in the expertise that we'll be using. So the point here is to assemble people who know about jobs, how jobs are structured, how skills are used on jobs. Computer scientists don't know anything about that. But we'll give to the experts who know about jobs, we'll give them the results from the step 2, so that they'll say, okay, we may not understand what the literature is in computer science, but here are the results for where computers are on all these different skills and how those compare with people. And now let's think about how different occupations might be redesigned to take advantage of those skills on the computer side. So this is the point where you'd actually look at the question about whether or not these computer capabilities are going to be applied. So it might be that in some cases, they're too expensive. It might be, in some cases, that they're jobs that involve interacting with a customer, and the customers won't stand to interact with a computer, and they'll just reject it. And so in that case, the particular capability won't be used. But the point is, the people who will be analyzing that will be people who know about jobs and how jobs are structured. It won't be the computer scientists who don't know that stuff. This is also the step where we'll then be able to see implications for skill demand and what it means for education. So we'll then have a sense of whether or not we're in scenario 1 or whether we're in scenario 2. And then finally, the last step is to propose a way of doing this again and again, since the technology is changing. So there's a question about how often we need to do that. Some people think that saying 2 to 5 years is far too long, so maybe it actually needs to be every 3 months. That's an interesting conversation to have. The point of step 4 is to have that conversation. And then there's the question about how you do the updating, when you do it. What do you need to look for, and what techniques do you use to do the looking? So that's the proposal. As I said, this is something that's being proposed from the OECD and the national academies. The idea for proposing this joint project was actually inspired by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which most of you are probably familiar with. If you're not familiar with the organization, you are probably at least familiar with its reports, because the reports come out every 5, 6, 7 years. They are the global standard for stating what the current state of the art is in climate science, what we know about what's happening, and what we know about being able to affect what's happening, and what kinds of policies would be worth pursuing. So the wonderful model of the IPCC is to bring together government on the one hand with experts on the other. So the Intergovernmental Panel is a panel of governments, 193 governments represented on that, and they essentially give the instructions, the questions that each report needs to answer. And then those questions go to the expert community, and the consensus process ends up drawing on a couple thousand climate scientists around the world to assemble the current consensus in the climate community about what we know. So the idea of the IPCC is the really important combination of working with governments who actually have the power to do something and engaging with the expert community who are, that's where the knowledge is about what it is that's happening and what needs to be done. So the idea is to have a similar combination with respect to computer capabilities. Also 2 C's, if you are into acronyms. So in some sense, the OECD is playing the government engagement side, and the national academies in some sense is playing the expert consensus side. So we have a development plan that's proposed for roughly a 6-year period, with the OECD raising the questions that need to be answered, interacting with policymakers, and conducting exploratory work in the different skill areas. And then the National Academy of Sciences carrying out formal consensus studies in each of the major skill areas. Partway through this development plan, we will have gotten information about the first 1 or 2 major skill areas that we will have looked at. We don't want to just let those sit until the entire development period is finished. So midway through, we're going to want to start the ongoing program, to start the updating process about the skills that we look at first. So partway through this, an ongoing program is going to begin to be developed with the idea that that will continue indefinitely for the rest of the century, or until we're ready to turn out the lights. So that's the that's the proposed roles for the two institutions. And just to close with a comment on the current status, over the last couple of months, the OECD has approved its role on its side and has provided initial partial funding for the work on the OECD side for the next biennium of work, and with an expectation that that would continue through the next two biennia. So that's a promising first step. We haven't gone through the formal approval yet on the National Academies side, while sort of waiting to see exactly what the structure of the project might be, whether it actually was going to be able to continue as a joint effort, which does thankfully appear to be the case. And we're also working on extensive fundraising on both sides to sort of complete the amount of funding that's required to move this forward. But it is now looking as though this will be able to launch at the beginning of next year. So that then brings me sort of full circle to the question raised in the initial title slide. And so the suggestion is that this type of program is what we actually need to begin to understand the kinds of challenges that AI is going to be posing, both for the education sector and for society at large. And so I think we're actually in good shape now for beginning to assemble one of the key pieces of information that we need to be able to have sensible policy conversations about this in the years ahead. So with that, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, we should swap.
Grab my water. So, where am I? Okay, voila. Yeah. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity, Sue and IIEP, and thank you, Stuart, for that. It's really, it's very stimulating. It's a bold proposal, I think, and it's a very structured way to think about how to make sense of a very what feels like a very unclear space at the moment. I'm sure we all know there's a lot of hype. Gartner has their hype cycle, and they say we are now at hype peak for AI, because we just don't know what's going to happen, but everyone's talking about it. So I have prepared a few slides, and generally, well, overall, there's kind of three main points, because Stuart and I have chatted, so I'd seen the slides and read the report, which is very interesting. So I had kind of three big questions. But before that, I just wanted to kind of zoom out a bit and just think about what is going around in most of our minds about AI, and what we're seeing in the reports, what we're seeing in media. Okay, so I'm sure you all know that AI is not new, but I didn't know that AI goes back to 400 BC as a concept. And the picture there is, the lady is Europa on the island of Crete. And this is a Greek myth. Its name is Talos, and it's an automaton made of bronze that was there to protect Europa from 400 BC. So go forward almost 2,500 years to 1956, when AI becomes an official academic field. Okay, so 1956. So it still has been around for quite some time. If you look at the history of AI, there's a great Wikipedia article, and it talks about these AI, the golden ages of AI, and also the AI winters. So there have been, since 56, periods of investment, of hype, of promise, what Gartner calls the trough of disillusionment. And so, for example, in the 70s, there was predictions in Life magazine. One of the experts said that within the 70s, we will have a computer with the general intelligence of a human being. So that was in the 70s. We're still nowhere close to that in 2018. And that picture at the top is one of the first kind of AI machines at IBM. And this is, does anyone know who that is? Okay, you'll know his name. That's Garry Kasparov. Yeah. So in 1997, 21 years ago, Deep Blue beat Garry Kasparov at chess. So it seems to be that when AI can beat a human in some sort of sport, it gets a lot of attention. And of course, the recent attention was around the Google machine beating the Korean player at Go. Okay, so there was an interesting piece in the Economist not too long ago, and I was struck by it was a special report by how it ended, and I'd like to read. It said AI will put an end to traditional ways of doing things and start a new era for business and for the world at large. It will be pervasive, devastating, and exhilarating at the same time. And this is kind of what it's saying. We don't quite know what to make of this thing, but it certainly is hot and it's interesting, and we certainly are taking great steps. So it's already in our lives, and if you use a smartphone, you are using AI. Basically, your predictive texting is based on AI. Your Google Maps route suggestions is based on AI. If you use Amazon or Netflix, your recommendations are based on AI. So from a commercial perspective, certainly it's much more in our lives than 1997. And all of this attention is setting off this, we were speaking earlier about this arms race, almost like a Sputnik race, but it's now for who can be the global leader in AI. So China has boldly said that it will be, or aims to be, the leader by 2030. And apparently a lot of the attention was sparked off by this Go match. And they want to be a leader in using AI in commerce, in government, in military, across the board. So you spoke about France. So France has put forward its strategy, which is very comprehensive. And interestingly, the president said that France and Europe has almost a moral position to guide the world through the ethical dimensions of AI. And then not long after that, the UK released a report that said that they are morally the best place to guide the world through this space. So there's almost a moral race. And we think UNESCO is best placed, actually. Okay, so there's a kind of a country race. There's also a race between companies. So a lot of the big companies, particularly Amazon, Google, and Microsoft, are betting heavily on AI. Amazon calls itself an AI company. The head of Google, Sundar Pichai, said that AI will have a more profound effect on humanity than fire or electricity. So who knows? They are also opening up AI services for companies, for people to use. So this is an example. This is a facial recognition service by Microsoft. For free, you can upload an image, and it will give you some data on the side on that image. So it says facial hair, just out of 1. Okay, so he has no mustache, bit of a beard, sideburns. He's not wearing any makeup. What's interesting is this, on emotion, the highest data point is on happiness. So 0.97%, which is actually quite good because he's not smiling broadly. He's not 100% happy, but you can see he's happy. And so these are some of the services that are available today. It's not to say these are easy to implement, that these are some services that you and I can just pick up. It is difficult to use the AI systems that are being implemented. Basically, what you need is a lot of data. You need an algorithm to train, and the algorithm will be taught on the data set to begin to analyze it and look for patterns. And you need raw computing power. And that takes time. One of the quotes interesting is the AI is idiot savant. Is that right? So kind of these taught idiots. So they can't really do things well, but once you teach them well, they can be very powerful. Okay, so there's facial recognition. This is another slide on that. So one of the most recent advances is computer vision. So previously computers couldn't see things well, and they still can't see things well, but they are getting better. And so facial recognition based on that is becoming very, very powerful. And interestingly, a lot of the selfies that you and I will take and post online, that data is being used to train these some of these public or some of these commercial data sets. Natural language processing has also come a long way recently. And that, I think, the general consensus is that that will improve. So this is Amazon Echo. And in there is their, not quite in there, it's actually, she's in the cloud, Alexa. But you talk to the speaker, and Alexa will understand your question, and in the background, turn it into text and some sort of command that can be fired off. So this is being hailed as the next interface, computing interface, human-computer interface, after the keyboard, then touch with iPads and iPhones, and now voice. And of course, AI is very good at data mining and pattern recognition. So this is a nice project by UNICEF, looking at high-resolution satellite imagery and analyzing patterns around where schools are based, and using that data to inform kind of development efforts to support schools and human movement patterns. Okay, so these things are available, but they are, like I said, quite difficult to train. And to your point, just because experts agree that AI can do this particular task, doesn't mean that the corner store down the road has bought that AI and implemented it and is ready to replace their worker. Okay, so what does this all mean for the place of work and for education? So does anyone recognize this little robot? It's he or she's, it's in the Uniqlo store in Saint-Germain, and you walk in and there it is. And I don't think it really does anything other than kind of startle everyone as they walk in. But it just has a little tablet and it talks to you. And one of the areas that gets kind of highlighted as interesting for AI or potential impact is customer services. And two nice examples around this are using chatbots to begin to handle initial requests from customers. So, to that point earlier in the Frey and Osborne, can you review a complaint? The two examples are from China Merchants Bank is the one. So they've developed a chatbot that responds to, I think, 1.5 to 2 million text requests per day on WeChat in China. And I don't think it answers all the questions, but it answers enough. And that's calculated to be a human workload of 7,000 people. But on the downside, there's no human connection there. So like you were saying as well, this is not something that is necessarily appealing to everybody. You're not going to develop a customer relationship when your chatbot is necessarily your kind of first line of interface. On the other hand, KLM is using AI with their customer service agents. So a text request comes in, and the AI prepares a response that the human agent either approves and sends back. So these are text-based, or can adapt. And using the system, they've doubled their efficiency from doing 60,000 to now 120,000 responses per week. But interestingly, their workload, their staff has only been reduced by 6%. So it's an interesting kind of not replacing the human, but perhaps making the human more efficient. And there are examples in supply chain management, recruitment. So especially kind of sectors that have tasks that are predictive and that are repetitive or with vast amounts of data. That's where we kind of know in the short term where AI is making big pushes. So in place, and we still don't really know kind of, how it's really going to play out, but these are some of the predictions. On the education side, AI is beginning to show kind of, show up in interesting places. I think it's more prediction at this stage. We know that education is slow to change. For sure, at the moment, there are a lot of educational technology companies telling you that they use AI and machine learning and analysis. There was an interesting data point that I think something like of the Fortune 500 companies last year and the year before in their annual reports, the narrative, the word machine learning and AI came up 21% times more. So just by saying it, you become more relevant. But this is perhaps where AI can actually improve the quality of education itself. So these are some things that we've seen for a while. This continuous use and assessment. So not kind of learn something, practice it, and get tested it, but you constantly being, as you're learning, imagine that you're being assessed in real time, and depending on how you're doing, that determines your learning experience. So these are some of the promises. I think some are closer, well, some are definitely closer to being realized than others. The big data for learning analytics, we all produce a lot of data, which is all written on pieces of papers for most of us, long gone. But imagine if that data was available and could be mined and could be analyzed to really determine what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are as a learner, kind of where you need interventions, how you learn best, what time of the day you learn best, what you're interested in. I mean, this idea of personalized and adaptive learning is very powerful. Virtual mentors and chatbots. And of course, all of this can produce real-time data for more advanced policy development. So that's kind of looking at AI to, on the one side, to improve the quality of education. So the first question is, can AI itself help education systems to anticipate the challenges of AI? So, Stuart, you presented a very rigorous kind of approach. Perhaps that approach could be complemented by data that's generated by the AI itself, by the students on the one side, on the education side, to better understand what kind of skills are being developed and how people are doing. Increasingly on the work side. So as AI becomes more embedded into the workplace in ways that sometimes are interesting for us and sometimes make us very uncomfortable. I'll give an example. Amazon just recently filed a patent for digital wristbands that could potentially track its workers on the factory floor from when they check in to check out. So it could make them more efficient if you understand kind of, this person's spending an hour a day at the water cooler and or they're kind of walking the wrong way around, this pallet. But there's also obviously issues around privacy. But as data becomes more pervasive in the workplace, that data can tell us what skills are actually being practiced. So one potential example is this recent partnership between the World Bank and LinkedIn. And LinkedIn is used by mostly professionals. Just by using it, it's generating, you and I are generating a lot of data on it. Rich data that the World Bank can now analyze and expose. So this is from South Africa. This is top in-demand skills from the recruiters who use it. But they're very tech-based. It does say select categories, so I'm not sure what else is available. But it tells you also that it's a very white-collar kind of professional space. Data is also not always representative. So this is missing the whole informal economy, basically. But in short, as we try and forecast what changes, how we need to respond to AI, let's think about using AI as a tool in that kind of in that tool set. The Economist article also wrote this point. Oopsie, I can't read here now. But basically, oh, sorry, I didn't realize you were also seeing that. Okay, there we go. Voila. So it believes forecasting could be more affordable, reliable, and widely available. So can that be applied in education? Okay, so what AI doesn't do well, it doesn't do human skills well. It doesn't do empathy, it doesn't do creativity, it doesn't do social skills, understanding, emotional intelligence. And so in one of the McKinsey studies, they looked at different sectors which are likely to be impacted by AI. Teachers was the lowest one, because teachers is a lot about human interaction, which the AI is not doing well. So for now, teachers are safe, they won't be replaced. But it doesn't mean that a part of a teacher's day won't be replaced. And if an AI can do something that is taking up a teacher's time that isn't efficient use of his or her time, then that's potentially something that can and should be kind of outsourced. So the question number 2, what do we know about educating for AI in education for the future today? And perhaps the word know is a bit strong. Perhaps what do we think we know? Or what are people predicting? So this is looking at formal education, non-formal, informal, but also importantly, work-based learning. So increasingly, these human skills are things that we can teach. If AI, following this model, if AI is not good at this, then let's focus it. And this is based on the thinking that AI and humans need to complement each other. So how can they bring out the best in each other? If AI can do heavy lifting and data analysis far faster than humans can do, then we don't need to be teaching more numeracy. We need to be teaching other things. So these non-cognitive skills around critical thinking, creativity, social skills. And interestingly, China, I mean, I'm raising China a few times, but it has come up because it's made such a big push on AI. Traditionally, the education system has been very strongly on maths and science, and kind of less strong on the human sides and these kind of social, emotional skills. Some schools, as part of the AI drive, are beginning to focus on these skills in recognition of these will be important in an AI world. Data literacy is something that we'll all need for sure. We are all producing a lot of data. We're all using a lot of data. We're all giving over a lot of data. So whether you're in the workplace or just a citizen here or in Cape Town or in Abuja, and we've seen this now with the Facebook issue, people are becoming at least becoming a bit more aware, not everybody for sure, but of the kind of data that they're handing over. So basic data literacy. On the other end of the scale, Carnegie Mellon has just announced that they will teach a dedicated AI undergrad degree. So perhaps, in response to losing their staff. But if there was one piece of advice you could give to a young person now, it would be study computer science, study AI, because the amount of money you could make in the short term, and I think in the medium term, is really good. Yeah, I wish I had studied that actually. But of course, we need to focus on lifelong learning and retraining. So we know that there will be disruption, and that's an underlying principle, which luckily we are kind of promoting already. But this becomes even more important. Okay, and then the third question is, what does this mean for developing countries? So there's of course the OECD focus, which is very interesting. But how do we think about this for countries that are not as advanced in AI, perhaps creating the AI, where the big tech companies are not based, where they don't have a potential commercial interest, and people in Pakistan or in South Africa are only users and not actually voices in the creation of the AI that influences them. So there's a huge issue around equity, around ethics, and the picture on the right, in South Africa, I'm South African. There's a law to say that you cannot have self-service at a gas station forecourt, and that is really there not because the technology doesn't exist, do it yourself. It's to protect jobs. So in a sense, we also need to think about how much this future happens to us and how much we have a role to play in steering it. Also, perhaps, and this is really something we need to try and understand, but in a sense, perhaps there is a silver lining to the fact that AI is becoming stronger in literacy and numeracy. If we have a deficiency, which we know we do on those skills, perhaps it actually opens doors for people who are low literate to be able to interact, create content, interface with services. And the work that I'm doing at UNESCO now is very much around this, kind of how to design digital solutions for low literate adults, low literate youth, low digitally skilled. And there's some great examples in health, in agriculture, where people are using apps and services. Perhaps they're just watching videos to teach them about growing crops. So very low tech on the user end. But in the back end, that data, for example, this is a real case in India, is saying, well, suddenly a lot of people are looking at this pesticide video in this province in India, which is unusual. That data is being collected, investigated, and it can do early reporting based on the algorithms and the predictions of a potential kind of breakout in that area. So here is somebody that's improving their livelihoods using the tech. Perhaps there's more heavy lifting and AI processing at the back end, but perhaps some of these interfaces and these technologies can actually open doors. Okay, I spoke about that. I think this is the last point, really, just to say all of these questions, you have different answers depending on how you frame them. So if you think about which country, which OECD or global, which socioeconomic group within which country, which sector, which companies, as well. So this is the Gartner hype cycle, and they say, machine learning is 2 to 5 years, but of course that's in the US. It could take a lot longer to get to other countries. So to help the conversation, we constantly need to try and focus a bit by bringing some kind of tightening the lens a bit. And that's it. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think this has been really stimulating. And I think it's also helped us see a lot of connections that we wouldn't necessarily have put together, especially in terms of education and ways to think about it. And we're really very grateful. Steve has asked 3 questions. I'm going to ask Stuart to respond to those 3, and then we'll be opening it up to everyone else. Is that okay?
So I think I have 4 comments with respect to the 3 questions, and so the first is a non-answer to the first question, and it's basically just saying that I think using AI to help anticipate the challenges of AI is a great idea. So that seems like a perfect thing to do. Just before you asked that question, you made a comment about the use of AI in education, and I think it's true that there are a lot of interesting potentials there. Although my reaction to that is usually slightly different, because I'm concerned that in the cases of the skills that AI is capable of developing well, that those tend to be skills that can be automated. And so we need to ask the question about whether or not we should be developing those skills at all, or whether we should be thinking about focusing on other skills that can't yet be automated. So I think we need to think very carefully about the signal of the ability to use AI in education and what that means about what we're teaching. So you had made a comment at one point with respect to I think the McKinsey study about teachers being an area that is not going to be automated soon, and I think that's correct, but I think it's not because of the reasons like the importance of empathy. I think it's actually the nature of the skills that are being taught that we need to keep in some sense. Whenever we see that AI is possible for teaching, we need to think about redirecting ourselves, because it's a signal that we're teaching the wrong stuff. So that was one comment. You asked the second question was related to the things that AI doesn't do well yet, and you mentioned things like critical thinking and creativity and social interaction. And so I tend to have 2 reactions to those lists. So my first reaction is, yeah, that's the right list. And the second reaction is, yes, but I think that those skills are actually much like literacy. That if we start to analyze them carefully, we will find out that there's a distribution of difficulty in each of those skill areas, and that the technology is already capable of tasks at the lower end, and many people are not capable of the tasks at the upper end. So when I hear those lists, I'm really concerned that they're seductive, and we have this sense of, yes, everyone will be doing creative tasks where they involve a lot of creativity and they're interacting with other people. And then you think about how many people you know who can do that. And it's the people in this room. It's not the people who do other kinds of jobs. And so we need to think very carefully about the people who are not at literacy level 4 and 5. That's associated with lots of other stuff. And if we're describing those people for what the jobs in the future are, finally, the point with respect to developing countries, I really like the notion about opening doors for folks with low literacy. But in general, my sense is I'm really concerned about the situation in developing countries in the same way that I'm concerned about 90% of the population in developed countries. I think it does rest on whether we're in scenario 1 or scenario 2. So if we're in scenario 1, then it will still be the case that there are things that can be done productively in developing countries where you're not going to destroy the employment base. But that's also true for developed countries. I mean, the argument in that case is there's lots of stuff that you don't need highly educated skills to prepare for, and those are skills that will be needed still in scenario 1. But if we're sitting in scenario 2, then we've got a problem. And I don't. I'm concerned that the developing countries will feel it harder and will feel it earlier, and will have fewer resources to be able to figure out how to begin to adjust. But that said, it will be really difficult in the developed countries as well. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think the equity issues are everywhere, not just in a by income level. And I also wanted to raise the issue of the purpose of education, which is not purely for livelihood. It's to assist humans to reach their potential, and the fantastic gift that literacy brings, the opening up of worlds, the opening up of the world of literature and stories, etc. And so when you were saying something about, well, maybe we don't need to teach literacy anymore, I was thinking, then that's the end of humanity and civilization, Yeah.
So
Please.
Desperately want to respond to that. So I do think it's possible that we're going to be approaching the end of literacy. But the ancient Greeks would have thought that was a good thing because they thought literacy was bad. But I think it's important to not equate education and what education is all about with work. And the piece of your comment that I really resonate positively to is this is actually a chance to rethink what human life is all about and the key role of the education system in preparing people for a meaningful life. And I mean, so I've given talks where people have said, well, if we can't work anymore, then what are we going to do? And what do you do about all those young people who will be outraged not to have jobs? And my reaction to that is, that's a failure of the education system. That's a failure of modern life, that we can't imagine a satisfying life outside of the formalities of work. I mean, the work-based structure that we've created over the last couple of centuries is really unusual in terms of human history. And so I think we're actually at a moment in time that is really scary, but offers amazing possibilities for rethinking our society. And the education system is dead center in that transformation.
Okay, thank you. Yes, please, go ahead.
No, thank you. And I just want to be clear. Literacy and numeracy are essential. They are essential. And this is a good point. It doesn't mean we should not teach them at all. Yeah. But what I've started to see in the work I've done through this UNESCO Pearson partnership is that, and potentially with these technologies, is that for people who are literate and perhaps who are not receiving the attention that they may never get another chance to study literacy, that now there's a possibility for some door to be opened and some sort of level of
Access
empowerment.
to knowledge and info.
Well, exactly, and
Channels.
exactly, and there's typically a kind of virtuous circle that if you get some sort of, if you can begin to use one part of your mobile phone and derive value from it, that you can now communicate with your children or receive money from them, there's an incentive there to develop your skills further. I mean, this is not proven. This is my kind of what I've seen a lot. So it's a kind of it's a toehold into basically a place where you can get to a richer kind of experience. Yeah. No, thank you.
I'm glad you clarified. Well, the floor is open. I welcome your comments. We have a microphone here. So we have 1, 2, 3.
Hi.
Please introduce yourself. Thank you.
Hello, Master at the IEP. And I had one question regarding, because when we talk about AI, usually people divide themselves between those who are totally in favor of it and those who are totally against because they're afraid. And I would be interested in defining what should we expect from AI? What can it do, and what do we want the AI to do? Because the people who are in favor of it is AI is amazing. We can do everything with it. We are just going to develop it to see where we can get to. But we should be thinking about what we don't want the computers to do at some point, to put a limit, a line that we shouldn't cross at all. Because AI is going to shape the way we think in the future. If we stop now and we are going to redefine education, we are going to redefine society, we should be thinking about how the artificial intelligence is going to shape this world and what we don't want to do. And people who are actually coding AI, we don't see them. When we talk about artificial intelligence, we don't know who they are. We see the computers, we see the robots, but we don't see the coders. Who are they accountable to? If they cross the lines that we don't want to cross, who can we say, you're wrong, you should? I don't know. If in my job I do something wrong, I'm accountable for it. I can get fired or wherever. But these coders, who are they accountable to? Because they're not visible. Thank you.
I'm Jacques Le Cavalier. I work here at IIEP as well. 2 short questions. The first one, Stuart, by the way, thanks for your presentations, both of you. Really, really great. First question had to do with why were social and emotional skills excluded from your simple model? I'm sure there's a good reason for it. Just wondered why that was. And in the work that is being proposed, you mentioned there will be efforts to redesign jobs, basically in adaptation to AI. I just wondered, how is the aim of redesigning fulfilling and interesting characteristics into jobs? How much is that a factor in that work, or is it mainly about employment and economy?
Oh, is it me? Oh, yes. You were after me. Okay.
My name is Eric Alemano. I'm a former staff member of IEP, now a consultant. I do a lot of work in developing countries, particularly Africa and countries in some state of crisis. It seems to me that there are certain applications of AI to certain examples. I know a young Congolese who runs what is literally a sidewalk school in Goma on the shores of Kivu. His students are car mechanics, waitresses, young market women who are trying to build some kind of literacy skills and get themselves ahead. How could an AI approach, perhaps through simple tablets, which are spreading very rapidly in Africa, help. Another situation, which is unfortunately very common, is refugee education. There are probably millions of children and youth in schools in refugee camps, and there is, like the sidewalk school in the DRC, a dearth of trained teachers, learning materials, and the like. How could IIEP or the international organizations that work with these populations develop applications of artificial intelligence for these audiences?
One more and then come back to the speakers, and then we'll move for, I have a few questions from the online audience, which we'll go to in the second round.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm Diata, come from Jackson State University. I'm an associate professor in mathematics at Jackson State University in Mississippi. My question is, since we're talking about information and technology in education, especially in Africa or in developing countries, where we know that access to information or technology is very complicated, what will be the impact of AI in those countries? Because even in the US, where technology has been infused in education, we know that using technology helps to access to information, questions, and answers. The question is now the retention. It doesn't help to retain the information, because we have seen that students who, after graduating, go to apply for jobs or interviews, they ask them questions. They fail to really deliver because the retention was not there. It's easy to access your information, but another question is to retain that information so that when you get the job, then you can really deliver. So my question is how that can help, how AI can help to do those two works together. Thank you.
Thank you. Stuart, would you like to go first?
Okay, I will go first. So Paulo asked about the limits on AI, combining together both what the technological limits might be and what limits we might choose to place on the technology. So my own perspective is that we will probably by the end of the century see computers being able to do everything that people can do. So I may be wrong about, the exact time frame. Maybe it'll take 2 centuries, maybe it will only take 30 years. But we are the proof that it's possible to, have cognitive beings that can do the kinds of things that we can do. And we exist in the physical universe. And I think it is, it's not possible to sustain a serious argument that we will not be able to get the technology to that point. And in a lot of situations where we kind of talk about the implications of AI, we think about the large companies that are developing this and trying to make a lot of money in doing that. And we think about that as being the motivation, and that certainly is driving this. But it is also important to realize that the other thing that's driving this is the human urge to understand ourselves, to understand how to do what we do. And there is no way that we are not going to pull on that thread until we get the answer. And so I think it's just a pipe dream to say that we could say no to developing the technology. Now, it's a separate conversation once the technology is developed about whether or not we're going to use it. And so the service station example in South Africa is a really interesting one, with saying, okay, we're going to not use what we could use. But I think it's actually interesting because it's very unusual. And I think many times when work is automated, we don't even see that it's been automated. We never saw the people who were doing the work in the first place. We saw the person who sold the product to us, but everything else that created the product in the world that we're living in now is invisible to us. And so if those people are automated, we'll read about it in the paper, but we never knew them. We didn't have a conversation with them that morning. And so I think it's going to be really hard for people to say, yes, I will pay twice as much for a car if I know that it was produced with fewer robots, or I will pay 4 times as much or 10 times as much. And, oh, I just got displaced from work. I have much less money now. What does that mean? That means now I'm forced to actually buy the products that are cheaper because they've been automated. So I can't buy my music anymore. I'm going to have to get free streaming music because I don't have any money. So I mean, I think the scenario for actually imagining that we will successfully refuse to use the technology when it's available, I think is unlikely. I'm willing to have the conversation, and I would be really interested to have a good conversation about it. A lot of people raise the possibility, but then, aside from your great example, aren't able to sort of follow through with this is what it would really look like. And here are the reasons when you look at human behavior where I can imagine putting this policy out there and having it be successful. So I haven't seen that argument. If there are people who have that argument to make, we should have that argument and see what it sounds like. So really interesting question, important to think about. So Jacques asked about why social emotional skills were excluded from the simple model. And the answer is because it was a simple model. So, I mean, it's a basic, 2-skill model. The social emotional skills have the same characteristic as the physical skills. They tend to be ones that we develop outside of formal settings in many cases, either just in the process of growing up or in the process of interacting with people carrying out tasks. It's not as though you go to school in many cases for learning formal techniques about how to interact socially. So, if you go to a mediation program or something, you would learn those techniques, but most of us don't. So for most cases, the way it would behave, I could have used that instead of the physical skills as the second one in the simple model, but that was just sort of a random choice. And now I can't read my handwriting about the second question. The business about fulfillment with respect to redesigning jobs. That's a great question. So yes, we have a choice about how jobs are designed. And to some extent, we actually can think about sort of making them into jobs that will be more fulfilling rather than less fulfilling. My image of what would be taking place in step 3 is the experts would be thinking about what are the possibilities for redesigning a set of different occupations. And I would hope that they would consider that dimension as well. But in some cases, it may be that there are no jobs there left for that particular occupation at all, that they're designed away completely. I heard someone speak recently who is big in the literature on career development and satisfying jobs, who made the case that we ought to be automating a lot of bad jobs and using that as an opportunity to create good jobs that people find engaging and satisfying. So I think it very much needs to be on the table for that piece of the project. And then there were 2 questions which I actually feel like turning to you with respect to the possibilities for using AI in education in developing countries? Because I think you're much better placed for thinking about those.
Okay, sure. So they're both great questions. I'll start with the one on kind of what can you do. You know, I always start with what's the development problem, not what's the technology. So the problem is that there are not enough qualified teachers, or the teachers are very unsupported. And how can technology provide, or can it even, and if it can, I believe it can in interesting and useful ways, how can AI play a role in that way? So I know that there are some development organizations. I had a conversation this morning with the WFP. I think UNICEF is also doing this work, basically still keeping within the education paradigm. So it could be formal or non-formal, but saying, okay, how do we provide virtual support to a teacher? Ideally, there would be another physical person, a mentor with that teacher on the sidewalk. School, we can't have that, but maybe there's something in between that's not as good as that, but that gets to know what this teacher gets to know his students or her students, and can provide some advice on how to best use that person's time and how to provide some sort of motivation, perhaps, or so that kind of personalized support. I think that's it. You know, if we start with what's the problem, let's think about how the tech can support it. You know, the holy grail of education is quality education at scale. And this is what technology, you know, often tries to say it can do. And I think in many ways it can help. It probably won't solve, it's not a silver bullet. But yeah, in what ways can AI help us to have one teacher that can serve more students, or that can take away some of the mundane parts of that teacher's job, so that teacher becomes more kind of, you know, a better resource and applies their time better. And then and of course, I'm happy to chat to you afterwards, because I also have some ideas here, and I think we should all be working in the space more. In terms of what the impact is, it's a really good question. I think, I mean, this is just off the top of my head. I think that there's at least two ways of looking at the impact of AI on less developed countries. The one is where the end user, because they don't have access to technology, misses out opportunities. So, you know, where your digital divide is playing a negative role and your kind of an opportunity divide. And the digital divide is real in the world. I mean, this year, half the world is online, which is an amazing achievement, truly impressive. But it also means the other half is not online. And the other half looks different to the first half. They're less educated, they're poorer, rural, female. This is general, okay? And less connected and less access. So one, by not having access, that's going to diminish your opportunities. I think that there are perhaps these operational efficiencies that happen behind the scenes that impact you, even if you don't have access to the technology. So, for example, let's say in South Africa, a trucking company uses AI to work out better routes for its trucks to take. It needs less drivers. That driver, whether they have access to AI or not, doesn't matter. They're impacted. So this kind of efficiencies that happen at a higher level, and perhaps they could happen in the US or in Germany or in the company providing this service. So in one hand, the digital divide is a factor. I think in another hand, it isn't really. Yeah. So I hope that helps. I have one quick thing to say. I kind of disagree a little bit. I mean, I hope that you're wrong about.
Go for it.
Okay. Not, about humanity kind of being bolder and standing up to the technology in a sense, or standing up to what is seen as kind of this inevitable technological juggernaut that moves forward, and I think a small example is the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, that's coming into effect in Europe next week. It's the reason you've all seen these emails to say everyone's updated their privacy policy, right? So, and it gives a lot more power back to the user. So you can now demand which data is being collected about you, what it's being used for. In theory, they don't know how this is going to be enforced, but in theory, you can, if an algorithm in LinkedIn or Facebook is profiling you negatively, you can contest that and have the algorithm changed. So, maybe the Europeans are going to save us all, because it is a very interesting, it's kind of, saying we can have a healthy relationship between the kind of the tech advances that benefit us all, but also regulating that in a healthy way. Yeah, maybe, hopefully.
Okay, I'd like us to move on to some of the questions that our online audience is asking. Dexter Pantel is saying he'd like AI to assist government in recruiting the best teachers, predicting learners who will leave school, forecasting locations where schools need to be established, etc. Are there current practices on these areas? They may not reach into AI. They may be more simpler IT use of database, but that's one question. And another person is saying, given that AI will continue, the use of AI will continue into the future, impacting many of the occupations that have level 2 or below, are current education systems, I think we were trying to get at this question, are current education systems capable of ensuring a greater number of educated adults performing at these higher levels? Because what we see now is not encouraging. And then the issue, which echoes our colleagues over here about concern about, well, it's a global issue, unemployment. Many countries in the world are trying to reduce unemployment, and it seems like AI is likely to contribute to it. What could be done to address unemployment issue? That's not a simple question at all. Okay.
I can take the first one.
Charlie, you can.
Okay. So just a quick answer is that I think that the answer is yes. Certainly AI could help you recruit better suited people if it understands better what the profile is and who that person is. And
some of the online recruitment.
Well, exactly. Yeah. So these are things that are happening exactly in recruitment services and tools that there's no, it's not unfeasible that they can't filter down into developing country education systems. For example, but they also really dig into issues of privacy and ethics. For example, in the US, there's a system which tries to predict the dropout of staff, because it takes about 20% of on average, a person's salary to replace them. Okay, so you want to keep them if possible. So this AI algorithm collects 60 data points about a person and tries to predict who is most likely to leave. Things like how often do they go on holiday? What are the gaps between holiday? What's the turnover of their managers? And so it's kind of saying, okay, this person's risk, look after them, comfort them, are they okay, retrain them. So it's definitely possible. And I think it's exciting. But I would say, I think in most part, there's a bigger problem here, is that the AI can solve the surface problem, but there are bigger systemic problems that cause people to drop out and cause teachers to be low trained or to leave. And those are the harder problems to solve, the societal, the cultural, the economic problems. And so, and I think a lot of these things that AI can do, often a good teacher could do. There are ones that proposals about facial recognition, pointing at the class to see who's frowning, who doesn't understand. But if you're a good teacher, you can, scan that class, unless there are 200 kids in the class. But I think then it's more case of riot control than actually individualized teaching. So yeah, thank you.
So the second question was in relation to the possibility of getting current education systems to prepare more people at higher levels of performance. And I think the answer is that we can do better. We have small scale examples that are more effective. I I actually think that we will be more successful in doing this if we start to think more seriously that we are preparing some people not for work, but for a lifetime of doing something else. Because too often now we think that it's okay if students go through a program and are not engaged, they're not interested in what they're learning. And that kind of education system in a future where people don't have jobs will be entirely pointless. Now you can at least say, oh, well, they learned some skills that they can use at work, and that was a good thing. But if you're trying to prepare someone for a satisfying life, if you're putting them in courses where they are not engaged and are not finding this exciting and captivating, then you have completely failed. And so I think, I mean, oddly enough, that part of getting the education system to prepare more people who can operate at literacy levels 4 and 5 is going to be really letting go of the idea that we're just preparing people for a bunch of jobs, and really realizing that we're preparing them for a satisfying life. For some people, that they will be able to get a job in that way, and we'll be able to prepare more people who will be able to get jobs when we prepare them that way, but we won't be able to prepare everyone. But that shift in the framework for the education system, I think, will actually be key, both for preparing more people at levels 4 and 5 who are going to work, and for preparing people who actually know how to lead a life outside of work. Then there was the question about unemployment. And I mean, as you can tell from my comments, I feel mixed about this, because unemployment is going to be a big problem, but it is also historically an amazing opportunity. And so the trick over the next 10, 20, 50, 100 years is to move the conversation towards the opportunity, and to not get caught in the sense that this all has to be about work, and we need to restrict ourselves to just thinking about adopting policies that will maintain employment, because that will just be a trap. But this is an amazing opportunity, and I think we have to figure out how to get ourselves to that point. And as I said earlier, it's the education system that really has the opportunity to lead in this respect.
Okay, thank you. So we have two. We're supposed to close at 6, so I see 4 hands. Dorian, you got the woman in black, I think, and there. Okay, so where's the microphone? Thank you.
Thank you, and sorry, I think I was quicker this time. My name is Dorian, I work here at IIEP. Thank you both for your presentations, and I'm not really sure this is a question, maybe it's more a reflection, and I'd like to have your views on it. The initial question was what the transition in skills is required, and it seems like we're in a bit of a race in finding which skills, the famous 21st century skills. What are those skills that computers won't be able to beat us at, that we should identify and then use the education sector to teach kids and future citizens, so that we keep having a role there. And like you said, Stuart, I mean, the whole thing about AI is, it's not going to stop. It's like the Promethean myth. Once it's discovered, it's going to be used. So we have to, just face it, and it's already there. And I was thinking that instead of trying to identify which skills we humans are still going to be useful at, and computers are not going to be able to do, maybe, I mean, instead of being very precise in finding what these skills are, which looks like a lost battle, maybe the idea ought to be, what are the foundational skills that humans have and that can be harnessed to get to those things that computers can do, such as creativity and so on. And these things, neurosciences today are helping us a lot in knowing. We know a lot about the brain's executive functions, how children, how the human brain and therefore children are developing, which leads me to education, early care and education, childhood, early childhood. And I'm wondering whether this is not where the big push should be made to save the world, basically.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Corinne Milou. I'm working currently on a report on the impact of AI on higher education for International Federation of Catholic Universities. And one of the questions I have is this: it has to do with timing. I guess it's a more short-term question about, given the current study cycle, in order to graduate, depending on systems across the world, let's say between 3 and 4 years, undergraduate programs, and then graduate another 1, 2, depending on where you're going. What will happen to that? Obviously, the pace of change is such that it looks like this study cycle will become obsolete at some point, because maybe it's already impossible to predict now the skills that will be necessary on the labor market 5 years from now. And when you have a study cycle of 3 to 4 to 5 years for students to graduate from higher education, what do you do? I'd like to hear you both actually on this. Thank you.
Okay. And then we had 2 right here towards the front. Thank you.
Okay, hope it's working. Hello, thank you very much for 2 very interesting presentations. Stuart, it's very nice to meet you. I actually worked for the OECD for some time, and I remember reading your blog post on the report when it was released last year. So it's very nice to meet you in person. I have 2 questions. Well, for us, I think for the majority of us in the audience, it's very important to think about the implications for education systems. And we saw some promise in higher education. Michaela and I, we both work on higher education. Although we're not certain to what extent actually these outcomes are attributed to, say, higher education versus to extraneous factors. So what would be your opinion in terms of, should we start tracking, assessing the skills on entry and the skills of exit of different education levels to be able to understand the role that different education levels actually play in development of skills? That's one. And secondly, what is your opinion on the role of entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship education in terms of tackling some of these challenges that we are discussing in terms of unemployment, and some of the jobs will be obsolete, and should education systems start thinking about integrating more entrepreneurship education into their provision? Thank you.
And finally? French.
Thank you. Let me speak in French because interpretation is available. So. Je voudrais également féliciter les autres intervenants pour la qualité des 2 exposés qui nous ont été faits. Exposés de très haut niveau. Et les questions que je voudrais poser sont les suivantes. Et nous avons vu les enjeux, nous avons vu les défis. It's not open.
I'm like, is this okay? I'm also not getting it. Yeah.
Nous avons vu les enjeux, nous avons vu les défis,
oui.
Mais en termes de, pour un pays en développement, par exemple, les questions se posent toujours en termes de priorité. les besoins sont tellement multiples de tous bords. Et il faut, quand vous êtes amené à gérer dans ces pays, choisir. Bon, quels conseils pouvez-vous donner, par exemple, à un pays, un gestionnaire, en ce qui concerne l'utilisation de l'intelligence artificielle? Et prenons par exemple les enseignants, et la formation des enseignants essentielle. C'est à ce niveau-là qu'un certain nombre de choses doivent se faire. Comment voyez-vous l'introduction progressive de l'intelligence artificielle dans les cursus de la formation des enseignants, par exemple? Et puis, une autre question qui me vient à l'esprit, c'est que il s'agit en grande partie de technologie. Et les technologies doivent toujours aller de pair avec l'environnement, la capacité d'absorption de l'environnement. Si vous amenez des technologies qui sont trop en avance, ils ne sont pas absorbés. Et donc, là aussi, c'est également une question que je pose. Qu'est-ce que vous pouvez répondre? Je vous remercie.
All right. Thank you. Merci beaucoup. So, turning back to the speakers for last round of comments. Thank you.
Well, do you want to take the first two?
Okay.
Yeah, especially.
So with respect to Dorian's statement about transitional skills and foundational skills and potentially the importance of early childhood education, my general sense is yes, we need to be, sort of thinking about how to make the education system as we know it more effective. Early childhood is certainly an area where people are pressing and thinking that there is more leverage there. And we need to think about the kinds of skills that are more likely to be the ones that will last longer. And so in Stephen's remarks, he actually, sort of talked about some of the kinds of things that appear on the lists. But at the same point, I think we need to be recognizing that I think we're playing a losing game. And so we also need to be just gathering the information to understand exactly how fast the technology is moving and be ready to start having a different conversation. So, I mean, I think, yes, absolutely. But at the same point, there's another conversation that we need to be ready to begin to have as well. On the questions related to the impact on higher education, I tend to have the reaction that we get a little hysterical about the notion that things are changing really quickly. I think it's actually important to teach people to read. And I mean, I sometimes casually describe the PIAC results as saying that 89% of adults in developed countries can't read. I understand that that's a high bar. I mean, it actually means reading, being able to interpret in sophisticated ways at a level that technology is not currently capable of. But that skill and ones like it are immensely important across a huge number of high-profile jobs. Those skills take many years to develop. And that sense that we have that things are moving really quickly is not, I think, going to immediately disrupt the importance of that kind of skill. And higher education should be developing that kind of skill. And it should not be the case that only 21% of the people who have a higher education credential are at levels 4 or 5 in PIAC literacy. So I think on the higher education side and the elementary and secondary education that feeds into tertiary education, there's a lot of work to be done on stable, well-defined skills that we need to figure out how to get a handle on. And so the buzz about how fast stuff is changing in some sense is a distraction with respect to those skills, because we're not ready to automate that stuff yet. It's still really, really important, and we are still not doing a good job.
Take the next one as well.
Okay, yeah. With respect to the question about the different education, the role of different educational levels in developing skills, my sense is, yes, we need to get better information about that. Quite frankly, the skills that are measured on PIAC, people usually think that graduates from secondary education ought to have. And so it's actually really shocking that graduates from tertiary education often don't have them. So there's an interesting question about who's responsible. Both parts of the education sector need to be working on that more seriously. Entrepreneurship, I will be honest and say that I don't know a lot about, one. And two, I'm not a big fan of, because I am concerned that it is yet again, it's another code word for the kinds of things that people can do who have literacy level 4 and 5. And that in describing types of opportunities that involve entrepreneurship, we are describing the kinds of things that people in this room can do, and that people who don't have the skills that we have can't do, and that we're just fooling ourselves. If we're talking about people being able to take a lot of initiative and create things that weren't there before, if they don't have key foundational skills that are really lacking, even in the developed world. So that's probably far too harsh a take on the movement for entrepreneurship, but it makes me uncomfortable that it's painting a picture of a solution that I don't think is actually there.
Yes. Steve?
Okay.
Right.
So I really don't want to stand between you and cocktails. So, so I'll be quick. It's a very good question. The priorities, all of these things play out in the context of countries where schools don't have running water or, not even teachers. So how do you prioritize? In many ways, I do agree with Stuart that the tendency to say the world is changing so fast, we all need to panic and we need to adapt very quickly as well. I think on one level it is true. On another level, I think that's not quite the case. The pace of speed and the level of innovation that you can absorb is different for different countries. But I do think we need to get better at skills forecasting. I mean, this is what the whole conversation is about. And I think that AI can play a role in helping established efforts in countries where perhaps there isn't a PIAC survey. How do we work with what we have on the ground? So it could be working with mobile network operators and the data that's generated by their customers in anonymized aggregate view to begin to understand what people's kind of, I'm thinking out loud here, but what kind of, not necessarily skills, although that there is some interesting work to predict literacy levels by the type of text messages you send and the frequency of texting. But how can we use the data we have to try and shorten that gap between the skills that are needed in the market and what's being provided? And I think AI has a role to play, but I would say in most countries, and I think you talk about countries with real needs and limited resources, it's okay to be a bit slower and to think carefully about how we use those resources well. and in this case, probably partner with the private sector, with the government, with the tech companies, and try to kind of use at the beginning, anyways, try to fill the gaps with what these new technologies do offer. Yeah. Okay.
All right. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our speakers and discussant. And thank you for that. I'd like to recognize the role that Michaela Martin has played in organizing the whole series of strategic debates. Thank you, Michaela. And of course, to thank our esteemed interpreters for their assistance. Please stay tuned for news of our next strategic debate. There isn't one scheduled right now, but I have a feeling there'll be one in June. So more news, you'll receive it. Thank you very much. Please join us upstairs for